What if the Great Commission wasn't primarily about love or community, but about conquest? I think it's time we explore how Christianity's most celebrated mandate became the ideological engine for colonialism, cultural erasure, and modern savior politics. And I also think it's time for Christians to challenge themselves to imagine a form of community that's built on solidarity instead of conversion. Welcome to another bonus edition of the MTB Podcast, a segment of the weekly episode that I call Afterthoughts. This is my favorite part of these weekly presentations because it gives me a chance to dig a little deeper into something that came up during the main episode. For centuries, Western civilization has wrapped its worst atrocities in the language of supreme benevolence. We are taught to look at the Great Commission of Matthew 28, the command to go and make disciples of all nations, as a beautiful blueprint for global love, charity, and connection. But what if the most celebrated mandate in Christian history isn't a message of community at all? What if it is actually the foundational operating system for global supremacy, cultural erasure, and cosmic colonialism? In this episode, I'm going to bust through the beautiful stained glass image of the Great Commission to expose how 5 verses from the Gospel of Matthew provided the psychological and legal permission to conquer the world, and why mainstream believers are still running the exact same operating system today. So let's talk about cosmic colonialism in this episode of Afterthoughts. If you walk into almost any Christian church this Sunday, you'll probably hear something about community. You'll hear about a love that knows no borders, a faith that unites humanity, and a mission to bring good news to the ends of the earth. It sounds beautiful. It sounds like the ultimate expression of human solidarity. But history tells a radically different, far more blood-soaked story. When Christopher Columbus set sail, when European empires carved up the African continent, when boarding schools were established to forcibly strip indigenous children of their languages and cultures, they were not violating the Great Commission. They were fulfilling it. You see, the moment a text declares that one specific group possesses the absolute exclusive truth and mandates that they must impose that truth on everyone else, community ceases to be an invitation. It becomes an ultimatum. It creates a toxic, non-reciprocal framework where one culture is permanently cast as the enlightened savior, and the rest of the world is reduced to a project to be managed, converted, or destroyed. To my humanist and atheist listeners, this isn't just ancient history. As you probably know, this colonial mindset still dictates how Western nations project power, how charities operate in the global South, and how modern white evangelicalism views the entire secular world. And to any believers tuning in, you have to confront a deeply uncomfortable reality. The system of global dominance you might actively despise didn't sprout from a misunderstanding of your scriptures. In fact, it was explicitly authorized by them. Now, before anyone starts clutching their pearls and preparing an angry email to me titled, "Actually, Jesus meant well," let me be very clear. Intentions matter far less than outcomes. I mean, you've probably said the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Lots of historical atrocities were committed by people who were convinced that they were the good guys. Very few people wake up in the morning twirling their mustaches and saying, "Time to erase a culture today." Of course, if Stephen Miller had a mustache, I'm sure he'd do that, but he's an exception. Most systems of domination survive precisely because they convince ordinary people that conquest is actually compassion. And Matthew 28 contains one of the most effective narrative engines for doing exactly that. The famous Great Commission, it can sound harmless at first glance. Go into all nations, make disciples, teach obedience. It can sound uplifting if you've grown up hearing it framed with soft piano music in the background and a smiling youth pastor wearing jeans and a hoodie talking to you about it. But read it carefully through a secular lens, and the verbs become impossible to ignore. Go, teach, obey, submit. The passage begins with a declaration of absolute authority and ends with a command to spread ideological conformity across the freaking planet. That's not pluralism. That's forced expansionism. And here's the core paradox we need to wrestle with. The humanist idea of community is based on mutual exchange between equals. It assumes that different people and cultures may have something valuable to teach one another. That's the core assumption. Matthew 28 doesn't actually allow for that reciprocity at all. The missionary enters the relationship already convinced that they possess ultimate truth. The other exists mainly as an object that needs to be transformed. The Austrian-Israeli philosopher Martin Buber called this the difference between an I-thou relationship and an I-it relationships. Humanism aims for I-thou, two fully human subjects encountering one another with dignity. The Great Commission, at least historically speaking, became an I-it machine. The missionary is the subject. The target population becomes the object. The missionary is I. The target population is it. That distinction matters because the moment you reduce another culture to a conversion project, you stop seeing it clearly. You can't see it clearly. You stop asking what wisdom might already exist there. You stop recognizing complexity. And once people become projects instead of equals, almost anything can be justified in the name of saving them. History demonstrates that with horrifying consistency. One of the biggest myths modern Christianity tells itself is that colonialism was somehow a corruption of Christian teaching rather than a direct application of it. But the historical record is brutally clear on this point. The legal architecture of European conquest was built explicitly on Christian theological claims. Let's talk about the doctrine of discovery, because most Americans have never heard of it, even though it helped shape the modern world map. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued a papal bull called Dum Diversas. This document authorized Christian rulers to invade, conquer, and subjugate non-Christian peoples. The document explicitly granted the Christians permission to reduce any non-Christians to perpetual slavery. Just a few decades after that, in 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued Inter Cetera, which essentially divided newly discovered lands between Spain and Portugal. It was like two mafia bosses slicing up territory at a backroom poker game. And what was the justification? Matthew 28. Christ had supposedly claimed all authority in heaven and on earth. Therefore, Christian empires saw themselves as having divine authorization to claim all physical territory on earth. And a couple different popes fully backed that up. Indigenous peoples who refused conversion weren't simply disagreeing with the European invaders. They were resisting the cosmic order itself. Once you frame resistance as rebellion against God, well, genocide becomes remarkably easy to rationalize. This isn't some fringe interpretation either. It wasn't invented by angry atheists on Reddit at 3 a.m. These ideas were embedded in international law. That's a fact. The geopolitical boundaries of entire continents were drawn using Christian theological assumptions instead of surveying equipment. The conquest of the Americas wasn't just accompanied by missionaries. The missionaries were part of the operating system. They were helping to drive the conquest of the Americas. And this is where things get uncomfortable for modern believers who insist, well, that's not what Jesus meant. Well, maybe not. But a text like this doesn't exist in a vacuum. If a teaching from your sacred scriptures in the hands of institutions that are pushing for power reliably produces centuries of conquest, slavery, and cultural erasure, then we need to stop pretending that interpretation of that text is some sort of irrelevant side issue. It's the point. Ideas have consequences. Theological operating systems generate historical outcomes. And Matthew 28 has repeatedly, time and time again, produced very horrendous historical outcomes. Frankly, if your good news consistently arrives on the same ships as empire, maybe it's time to reevaluate the product you're trying to push onto everyone else. Nowhere is this more obvious than in the residential and boarding school systems of Canada and the United States. If you really want to understand cosmic colonialism in action, don't just look at military conquest. Look at what happened to children. Schools like the Carlisle Indian Industrial School operated under the infamous slogan, "Kill the Indian, save the man." And yes, that phrase is every bit as horrifying as it sounds. Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families. They were stripped of their languages. They were given Christian names. They were forced into European dress codes and punished if they practiced their own cultural traditions. Their hair was cut. Ceremonies were banned. Family structures were disrupted intentionally. And all of it was framed as love. That's the part people struggle to process. These systems were not usually run by cartoon villains cackling over their maps. Many of the people involved genuinely believed they were somehow helping. That's precisely what makes ideological supremacy so fucking dangerous. When you become convinced that another culture's identity is fundamentally inferior or somehow spiritually defective, cultural destruction can start to feel like compassion. The Great Commission contains this logic embedded directly within it. Teach them to obey everything. It doesn't say to exchange ideas with them. It acts as if you have nothing to learn from them. There's no need to build mutual understanding. You just need to make them obey. That creates a one-way flow of legitimacy. The missionary may teach, but they may not truly receive, because there's nothing worth receiving from these people who are inferior. Imagine the arrogance required to encounter civilizations that are thousands of years old, in many cases far older than your own civilization, and assume they had nothing meaningful to teach you about ethics, ecology, spirituality, or human flourishing. Europeans arrived on continents they barely understood and immediately concluded, yes, clearly these people need our superior worldview. That level of arrogance is just frickin' mind-blowing. But honestly, we still run this same operating system today, especially evangelicals and conservative Christians, especially Christian nationalists. They just explain it differently and make it look really good on Instagram. Here's what I mean by that. Modern evangelical mission culture usually presents itself as sort of harmless service work. Teenagers fly to the global south. They do a half-assed job building a fence. They take a bunch of selfies with smiling children in tattered clothes, and they come home emotionally transformed after spending a week changing lives. Meanwhile, the local community that they flew into could have used the funds spent on that little feel-good trip to hire skilled laborers from within their own community for far less money and with significantly fewer bent nails and loose fence boards. But the actual function of most of these short-term mission trips isn't to solve structural problems. The purpose is to reinforce identity. They condition participants to see themselves as benevolent rescuers entering spiritually deficient places. The people being helped become just props in a moral drama centered on the missionary's self-image. And notice how conveniently this framing erases any sort of historical accountability. Western powers destabilize regions through colonialism, through resource extraction, and then financial debt structures that we create, and through political interference. And then Western churches arrive later with donated T-shirts and a ukulele worship service, acting like they've descended from heaven itself. That's not justice. It's an attempt to build a facade to cover past conquest. Even many secular charities unintentionally inherit this mindset. The assumption remains that wisdom flows primarily from wealthy Western institutions outward toward less developed societies. But a healthy community requires reciprocity. It requires humility. It requires the possibility that the people you're trying to help may understand some aspects of human flourishing better than you do. Humanism offers a radically different model. Instead of some sort of cosmic hierarchy, it just demands solidarity. And instead of conversion, we're focused on collaboration. Instead of saving people from themselves, humanism asks how human beings can cooperate as equals despite cultural differences. Frankly, that's a hell of a lot harder. Mutual respect is much more difficult than paternalism because it requires surrendering the fantasy that you are the enlightened center of the universe. When you try to approach someone in solidarity, you have to give up that point of view. So here's the uncomfortable question sitting underneath all of this. Can someone truly love another person while simultaneously believing that person's core identity, their worldview, and their culture just need to be replaced? How can you believe all that shit and still claim to love that person? You can't. That's the tension sitting at the heart of the Great Commission. Because if your highest moral goal is converting everyone else, then the relationship can never fully be equal. There will always be an invisible hierarchy in the room. One person is cast as spiritually complete, the other becomes a problem to solve. Humanism rejects that framework entirely. It says community is not built through ideological surrender. Community is built through shared human needs and shared human vulnerability. Working together on food, shelter, safety, art, meaning, love, curiosity, cooperation. None of those require cultural conquest in order to exist. And honestly, this challenge extends beyond religion. Human beings constantly try to convert one another, not just spiritually, but politically, culturally, socially. We all carry the temptation to turn our relationships into some sort of recruitment drive. We want people to become extensions of ourselves and our way of thinking because, well, differences can feel a bit threatening. But real community just can't exist without pluralism. If a community only functions when everyone thinks exactly the same way, it's not community. It's conformity. So I want to leave you with a challenge tonight. Audit your own life. Where are you trying to fix people instead of simply understanding them? Obviously, parents are going to struggle with this. How often do we try to fix our kids rather than understand them and walk with them? Right? Where are you treating disagreement with someone as sort of a contamination instead of an opportunity to see something differently, an opportunity to learn and maybe grow? And where have you inherited systems that demand obedience rather than systems that focus on mutual flourishing? So audit your own life. Look closely at these things. Because the goal should never be to build a world where everyone is just a carbon copy of us. The goal should be to build a world large enough, humane enough, and secure enough for people to remain fully themselves while still caring for one another. That kind of community doesn't require conquest, but it takes a hell of a lot of courage. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Afterthoughts. If you want to keep up on everything I'm doing, please head over to thecodaproject.com and subscribe to my newsletter. You'll get notifications whenever I publish anything, and I'll also keep you updated on the weekly live streams of Mythologizing the Bible. If you subscribe for free over at Coda Project, you'll start receiving my publication called The Weekly Compass. This is a brief guide on a single core value. You can think of it as a mini lesson plan for personal growth. It's perfect for families, students, and adults because I include discussion questions designed for each age group. As a subscriber, you'll also have access to the Guide to Kitchen Table Activism, which is a detailed resource designed to help you be politically active from your own home. The guide explains why activism is important, the philosophy behind kitchen table activism, and the foundational values it supports, before laying out how to use the tools you have to make your voice heard. It provides tools, tactics, and templates for you to use, and it only takes 15 minutes a week. If you care about our democracy, our country, and our world, then I encourage you to check it out. While you're at it, make sure you hit the subscribe button so that you'll start receiving my newsletter called The Kitchen Table Activist. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember to question everything, keep what's good, and live what matters.